Okay. Well, good afternoon to our audience here at CSIS in Washington and to everybody watching online or tuning in from Asia, possibly a few hours from now because it'll be recorded by then. I'm Michael Green. I'm Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at CSIS and Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown University. It's our great pleasure today to welcome you to this conference, the title of which is Can America Lead in Asia? And we're partnering for this with NABEA, the National Association for Black Engagement with Asia. We'll talk a lot about American leadership in Asia, but we'll also talk a lot about leadership in foreign policy and hear from some remarkable veterans of American diplomatic service and also a new generation rising up in the field. We'll learn more about NABEA. And then we'll talk on two different panels, one which I'll moderate on diplomacy and security in Asia, and the second which my colleague Matt Goodman will moderate on trade and economic issues in Asia. And we have some distinguished panelists joining us for each of those. For our opening remarks, though, we're delighted that the Ambassador to the United States of Australia, Ambassador Arthur Sinodinos, has remarks for us. Ambassador Sinodinos was previously Australia's Minister for Industry, Innovation and Science and a Senator for New South Wales in the Australian Parliament from 2011 to 2019. I worked with him when I was in the Bush administration in the Bush White House. He worked for Prime Minister John Howard at the time. We've asked him to open up the conference for us with some thoughts from the region, from our close ally Australia, on what's expected of the United States, what's needed from the United States, where are we delivering, where are we needing to deliver more. So let's hear from Ambassador Sinodinos. Thank you.
To address you today, and congratulations to NABEA for your important contribution to broader American commitment to the region. You're important in reflecting the true diversity of the US to the world. It's also the case that making the best use of all of our the talents of all of our people, will bring about the best results. Your capacity for cross-cultural understanding and empathy is important. So often diplomacy is about putting yourselves in another's shoes and understanding their journey. You follow in the footsteps of those who have broken through various ceilings. So all strength to your arm to ensure those ceilings remain shattered. And thank you to Mike Green, a great friend of Australia, who's the next CEO of the US Studies Centre in Sydney. Congratulations, Mike. You're going to do a great job there. You bring great experience in government, in academia and think tanks to the role. In Australia, people are really excited that you're taking up that role. Now, the subject matter that's been suggested is, what does the region want from the US? Now, the first question, of course, is what region are we talking about? And I've interpreted this broadly to cover the Indo-Pacific as a whole. And this goes beyond Asia-Pac to encompass India. And this concept of the Indo-Pacific is one which has taken increasing root in recent years. And the first thing that the region wants, simply enough, if I come to the bottom line, is ongoing sustained commitment by the US to engage across all areas. Now, some of you will remember the famed pivot in the Obama era, but that was not followed through apart from some specific initiatives, including, for example, in Australia, we had the Marine Rotational Force and some related programs. The US negotiated the TPP, but decided not to join. And during the Trump era, while China became the overriding focus of Asia policy, attitudes to allies and partners were mixed at best. And along with attendance at Asian summits being sporadic and some important diplomatic posts remaining vacant for too long, including Australia and the Ambassador to ASEAN position. Now, I don't say all that to diss on previous administrations, but to give you a flavour of the perceptions in the region as we came into the Biden era. Now, the arrival of the Biden administration boded well in this regard. The president was very quick to put more focus on allies and partners and laid the groundwork for a greater focus on the Indo-Pacific. Importantly, this reflected a focus on internal government processes the National Security Council was expanded in its coverage of the region, and Kurt Campbell, a very senior and experienced Asia hand, was appointed as the Indo-Pacific coordinator at the NSC. And Kurt, great friend of Mike's, great friend of Australia's, has been doing a fantastic job in that role. And policy moved early with the convening of the first Quad leaders meeting. I'll come back to that. The nature of the Quad, it evolved from the tsunami in 2004. And of course, at that time, it was seen as a way of bringing together like-minded countries, Australia, Japan, India, and the US, to help with humanitarian and disaster relief. But it was built on a positive vision for a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. It's not a military alliance. It's not an Asian version of NATO. Its origins in the tsunami speak to the fact that it's forward-looking, thinking about how we improve the Indo-Pacific where we live. And this group is generating a wealth of new initiatives. Its first priority was around vaccines, very important in this pandemic situation. This was to be done by promoting vaccine production in India, financed by the US and Japan, and with countries, including Australia, providing the last mile distribution to get the vaccines into people's arms. Other issues that are being tackled in the Quad context, including how we keep each other honest on climate policy and promote new initiatives that'll accelerate renewable energy take-up. Critical and emerging technologies have become a big focus of what the Quad is about. This is about setting norms and standards for critical emerging technologies like AI, machine learning, quantum, cyber. You go through the list. These are technologies which have both economic and national security impacts. And it's important for us to lay down standards for how these technologies are developed and to push back against those who would impose their own standards which would be inimical to the sort of global rules-based order and the values on which it is based. Other areas Quad are looking at are now infrastructure provision. How do we coordinate what we provide as infrastructure to the region, to the Indo-Pacific? And importantly, recently, the STEM fellowships, which is a way of promoting the establishment of a cadre of science, technology, engineering, and maths graduates in the region who not only understand about these important disciplines, but also about the public policy aspects of STEM and how we work together to promote appropriate norms and standards and public policy in these areas. Now, the Biden administration recognized China as what they describe as a pacing threat to the US. And so allies and partners, interestingly, were consulted before the administration engaged with China. And this resulted in a policy of what we call the 3 Cs, areas where there will be competition between the US and China, principally around technology. And this goes back to the point about critical and emerging technologies mentioned before. Cooperation in areas where problems are too big to be solved by any one country. Climate comes to mind. Nuclear non-proliferation is another, and so on. And then, of course, there would be areas, not so much of confrontation, but of pushback. For example, in areas like human rights, calling out abuses of human rights. The US adopted this schema of the 3 Cs. And later last year, AUKUS was announced. That was announced in September last year. And that's not so much a new strategic alliance as a capability pact between Australia, the US, and the UK, one which recognised the changing geostrategic circumstances in our region. Now, this was an Australian initiative. We took this to the US and the UK. But the fact that the US was prepared for the first time in 60 years to share its crown jewels, its nuclear navy technologies, was a very important step for the US. and an indication of the faith they place in us, in our capacity to be stewards of this technology, but also a recognition of those changing geostrategic circumstances. And importantly, lately, the US has sought to come back to the issue of trade and economic engagement in the region. This is an area where the region is particularly interested in what the US has to offer. And the US has announced the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. This was unveiled as its response to concerns about its trade and economic relationship with the region in the light of the demise of its participation in the TPP. Now, of course, subsequently to the US not proceeding with the TPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive TPP, CPTPP, was created by the 11 remaining countries. This was spearheaded by Japan, Canada, and Australia. And in the region today, the challenge we face is that China continues to expand its trade links. It joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is an arrangement between the ASEAN countries and their free trade partners, which include Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Japan, and China. And China is also knocking at the door of the TPP. They're asking to be a member of the TPP. They're seeking to join the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement that New Zealand, Singapore, Chile, and others have put together. So time in the region is not standing still. China is continuing to seek to expand its influence, particularly in that trade and economic space. And one of the things that the region wants from the US is a solid and substantial response to that. The IPEF is America's response, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It consists of a number of pillars. First pillar is around trade. It's an amalgam of digital trade agreement subject to labour and environmental standards being adopted by countries in the region. There's another pillar which is around decarbonisation and infrastructure. There's a third pillar around supply chains, how we reorient supply chains. This is a very important issue in the region as we seek to reduce our dependence, particularly on China, in areas like critical minerals, which are so important to renewable energy, electric vehicles, and to defence. And the other pillar is around global tax arrangements and anti-corruption measures. These are the four pillars of the arrangement. They're in the process of being discussed with countries in the region. The US intention is to reach out beyond its traditional allies like Australia and Japan, for example, to particularly countries in ASEAN and to India. And so we have four sets of potential areas of negotiation and discussion coming up. The great challenge with IPEF is that it doesn't offer market access. It's not like the TPP, which was a traditional trade agreement in that sense. But in the absence of market access, the question the region is asking is, what are the other incentives? What are the other carrots for countries to be involved? So that's one of the challenges we face. That's one of the things we have to raise with the region. Now, because of the conflict in Ukraine, which has upended many of our assumptions about the post-Cold War era, the US, of course, has had to engage intensively in addressing the unfolding conflict. And from our perspective, the US, has firmly asserted global leadership, and of course, it's led to the revitalization of NATO. It's helped to restore the US reputation for policy competence after Afghanistan, the adroit use of declassified intelligence to try and wrong-foot Putin, the proportional approach to responses to avoid undue escalation. This has all gone reasonably well, and it's summed up by the mantra, nothing about you without you. And this is important, particularly given the perceptions about how Afghanistan was handled. The important point is this. There has been concern in some quarters that the US would become reabsorbed in transatlantic matters at the expense of the Indo-Pacific. This is not proving to be the case. The US is keen to show that it can walk and chew gum. In any case, the Ukraine conflict matters far beyond Europe. We're all concerned about how this plays out and the impact it has on the global rules-based order. And therefore, Australia, Japan, and Singapore have been quick to impose measures and sanctions against Russia. And the US is mindful of the signals that its handling of Russia sends to China and her intentions in Asia. And this has been one of the issues that's been very much on the mind of the US in dealing with Russia, to seeking to make sure that Russia doesn't actively support, to make sure that China does not actively support Russia, and that this does not extend particularly to military hardware and the rest. So this has been an important issue for the US, and I think that to date it's been handled well, and countries in the region have been reassured by the way that the US has done so. And so the US is keeping up the tempo of its engagement in the region. Examples include scheduling summits and travel to the region, in the process of scheduling a summit in person between ASEAN leaders and the president, looking at travel to the region for the next in-person Quad Leaders Summit, looking to engage Pacific Island country leaders in the region. The US is continuing to expand its focus. As I said before, for countries in ASEAN, US trade and economic engagement is a priority. They're not keen to be in the middle of geopolitics or asked to take sides. If you ever want to read about this, Prime Minister Lee of Singapore has written some really excellent pieces around how countries in the region want the US involved in the region, but they don't want to be seen as taking sides. And this is because they have to live with China. China is next door. They want to have a good relationship with China, but they want to have a US presence that goes beyond defense and security and is locked in by a trade and economic presence, because they see that as genuinely locking in the US to the region on a long-term basis. And of course, that was President Obama's vision when the TPP was being negotiated. So from our perspective in Australia, as strong allies and partners of the US, getting the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework right will be important. And as I said before, in the absence of market access, what are the other incentives that will bring people to the table? Now, in its engagement with the region, the US is mindful to highlight the centrality of ASEAN, to avoid the implication that because of all these other structures that are developing in the region, whether it's the Quad, AUKUS, etc., these are not seeking to dictate the future of the region to itself, that they're meant to complement what is happening in the region, to complement the structures in the region, and to say that the structures around ASEAN and the other structures related to that, the East Asia Summit, all the other institutional paraphernalia, the APEC and all the rest of it, that the US is not seeking through new groupings to dictate foreign policy outcomes to the region. The other area where I should mention before I finish, the US is making important inroads is the Pacific, particularly the South Pacific. Geostrategic circumstances are changing in that region, but a bit like ASEAN, Pacific countries don't like to feel they're in the middle of some geostrategic contest, and yet in practice, that is what is happening as China continues to seek to encourage countries in the region that recognize Taiwan to change their recognition to Beijing. And this is having some interesting effects in the region. We're seeing the latest manifestation of that in the Solomon Islands, which changed recognition a few years ago to Beijing, and which is now signing a security agreement which could pave the way for more Chinese forces and basing in the Solomon Islands and therefore in the region. The US for some time has been concerned about these developments and has been upgrading its presence in the region, looking at new initiatives that it takes to address the issues that matter to the region, like climate change, What happens about maritime security and maritime domain awareness? What happens about irregular, unreported fishing and illegal fishing? Very important issue for the livelihood of so many of the island states in the Pacific. Looking at a whole series of initiatives to take in that region. But again, like ASEAN in particular, like Southeast Asia, important that we deal with the region on its merits, and that our approach is that everything we seek to do in the region, in the Pacific, is to encourage the independence and sovereignty of countries in the region. I've roamed all over the place. The Indo-Pacific is a big place. I hope I've given you a bit of a flavour of some of the expectations of the region and how they like to be treated and perceived. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be with you. Thank you for your enthusiasm and your interest in Asian engagement. It's very important that the US gets this right. And with your knowledge and expertise, I believe you can make a great contribution to that. So thank you, Mike, and thank you to those of you watching today for the opportunity to address you.
So I want to thank Ambassador Sinodinos for the generous welcome he extended to me as I go to Australia. I'm not there yet. I'm not going for a little while, but I'll be taking over one of the think tanks in Sydney. Looking forward to it very much. Hope you all will visit. And I thought the ambassador gave us a right on the money, perfect description of what this region, and of course there's variation, but what our closest friends in this region want and need from the United States. And we'll come back to some of those themes with the panels. Matt Goodman and I will moderate in a moment on diplomacy and on trade and economics. But first, we want to learn a bit more about NABEA. And I'm joined by two of the founders. Terrell Walker is the CEO and founder of NABEA. He was a student of mine at Georgetown in the Asian Studies master's degree program and went to Harvard undergrad for government and East Asian studies. And Chadwick Eason is the COO, co-founder, and he's the director of NABEA's DC chapter. He worked for Samsung in South Korea, and he worked at nonprofit organizations in Japan. So two really solid Asia hands with experience in business. Terrell worked in the State Department in the Philippines and China, and starting out on a trajectory in this field that's going to be very, very important. So let's start with NABEA. The ambassador, I thought characterized it right when he said, from the perspective of U.S. friends and allies in Asia, this is a terrific development because it broadens the engagement of American society, and it brings more talented people into a field which has been, for a long time, sort of obscure. And let's just say, not the usual path that most American kids think of Asia. And so from Arthur's perspective, from friends in the region, it's a broadening and a deepening of American engagement, which is good for all of us and all our friends and allies. But when you guys started this out, you were students, and it was a pretty small group, and now you have over 300 members, and it's a major national organization. But Terrell, we'll start with you. When you guys started this, I know we talked a little bit when you were at Georgetown, but when you started off on NABEA, what was the gap you were trying to fill? What were you trying to achieve?
Well, so NABEA is the National Association for Black Engagement with Asia, and it is a global community of Black Americans who focus or engage with Asia from all walks of life. So this includes people in diplomacy, people who work in finance in Singapore, people who are serving actively in government, people who have retired, a wide variety of people. And together we are really dedicated to raising Black voices in US-Asia discourse and making sure that Black expertise is taken seriously in this field. And one of the things that we always say, like the ambassador mentioned, is we're trying to make sure that the faces of American engagement with Asia are as diverse as America itself. And so the story of NABEA is very much the story of many black people who are in this field, which is almost all of our members have experienced being the only black person in the room related to Asia, the only black person in their Chinese language class or their Japanese language class or in a conference related to Asia. And despite the importance of this US-Asia relationship, Black America is often left not at the table, left out of the socioeconomic and cultural benefits that come from this important relationship. And so we are left out of this conversation, and when the people who are a part of the conversation oftentimes struggle to make sure that their expertise is taken seriously. And so with that in mind, from those conversations, that's how NABEA was born. And it started out with several of us, just a group who have, I've known Chadwick since I was in college, and we'd talk about these issues forever, for many years, being like, we wish we knew more black people engaged with Asia. We know they exist. Where are they? Let's get together and try to make that group. And funny enough, like you mentioned, you're actually very much a part of, and your allyship is very much a part of NABEA's founding, because when I was in graduate school, I and another student, Kyle Easton, we came to your office and we said, you know, we have this idea of creating an organization that really focuses on increasing black engagement with Asia. And we came to you and we said, oh, you know, do you think that would be something that would be of interest? And you were very, very helpful in helping connect us to people. And now NABEA is more than 300 individuals focusing on Southeast Asia, from China to Japan to Korea, and all across the world. We have a black sommelier in Tokyo. We have people working in Goldman Sachs in Singapore. We have foreign service officers serving in Shenyang, in Manila, from a wide variety of places. And that's kind of what we've been doing, is reaching out to individuals and trying to build this community to make sure that Black America is a part of this important trans-Pacific story.
And Chadwick, you guys started this a couple years ago, before the BLM movement, right? Before Black Lives Matter. So this was not reaction to anything, I gather. This was your experience and your desire to build this community. Did anything, as you grew, you know, exponentially, doesn't even describe it, you know, from a few DC-based young professionals and students to a global organization. Anything surprise you? Were there things that you discovered that were kind of inspiring or a little bit surprising in terms of what people are doing in the organization around the world and in Asia? Right.
So I think every day I am surprised by our community. I think we all see each and every person who joins, and we have people joining each and every day. And I think I've been surprised by a couple of different things over the course of the past, you know, these short 3 years. One is just the growth of the community and the support from these kind of surrounding community, just in terms of advancing our mission and ensuring that the Black community within the US-Asia space is taken seriously. I've also been extremely amazed at just the sheer accomplishments from all of the community members who join. I think each and every day when we have these welcome calls with individual people who join, because at the end of the day, it's a community, it's a network that we want to really foster and build. I am amazed at what they've accomplished, you know, the height of the language abilities that they have, the influence that they've had on, you know, students within their communities, you know, some of their, you know, younger siblings or some of the younger people within their communities. You know, their influence is major, and I think they should really understand that, and I really hope that the world really understands the impact that they have.
I can tell you, just at least anecdotally, as we look at admitting a new class in Asian Studies at Georgetown, that you're having an impact, because students who, you know, in undergrad or even in high school got interested in anime, or kind of got interested in China, or wanted to do K-pop, and didn't know a lot of other kids like that in their communities. Applying for grad school, they know about NABEA. Like they know about it. They know there's a community here. There are people who are doing this, and it's kind of exciting. And then the other thing, as you built this effort up, is you're demonstrating how many prominent Black Americans have made a difference in U.S. engagement with Asia. And we'll hear from some of them shortly. But it's until you guys did this, I worked with a lot of these distinguished diplomats, but until you sort of created the community, honestly, people, I don't think, thought about what a significant roster there is of important players in the history of American engagement with Asia. So it's already having impact. Terrell, what would you like to do next? Right now, it's a community. You're obviously mentoring people coming in the field. You're connecting different generations. What's the next thing you'd like to do with NABEA in the years ahead in your spare time? Because you have a full-time job, right? Yeah.
We do a lot. We do institutional engagement with organizations to make sure that they can expand and create spaces for Black people. Within those spaces, we work with students to mentor them. And there's so many areas that we want to explore. One of that is in the students and the young people, because that's a lot of times where you really need to capture people who are interested in this space, but they don't know or see other people like them, so they don't know that this is a viable path for them to go down. So we want to really make sure that we're encouraging and working with organizations and extending students overseas. We're working with one organization about sending students, Black students, to Japan for a summer. So we're really making sure that we expand on that, really reach out into the youth, and we want to see, we're already seeing NABEA members throughout all areas of U.S. policymaking. We have people in congressional committees, we have people in state, we have people in DOD, and just wanting to see more of that and making sure that the people who are already there are really taken seriously. And I don't know if Chadwick wants to also add to that.
Sure. I think the only point that I would add to that is the fact that we want to continue, because we already have, as Terrell said, we've done a lot of work in the past 3 years. But one thing that we want to continue to do is provide professional development opportunities to those members who already are at that next level, but want to even surpass what they've already achieved. We already have developed mentorship programs, and we want to expand that to ensure that those who are young professionals now can accomplish everything that everyone in the audience, or all of the panelists who are going to present today, have achieved in their own lives. And we want to do whatever we can to provide those opportunities.
What are the biggest challenges as you talk to people at all generations going to this field who are Black Americans, for whom working on Asia is an unusual choice? It's not something that the people I've talked to, students and stuff, it's something they were the only one, as you said, in the room, but they're also the only one in their family maybe who got into this. So what are some of the challenges that people are confronting that you're finding out about or helping people think through as you mentor them?
Well, some things that we talk about is getting families acclimated to as well. So one thing that we've encouraged people do is encourage people to talk to their families and say, oh, hey, there's so-and-so who has done this before, so-and-so has done this before. So really creating that space where people feel like they're supported. Also connecting people to each other. Again, it comes down to, if you're all by yourself, then you can't really thrive. But when you're a part of a community, that's what really creates that foundation that allows you to build and build and build and become the success that you already are, but become even more so.
And Chadwick, we were talking a little bit earlier, but there are these fascinating connections, cultural connections, cosplay, K-pop between African American communities and Korea or Japan or China. Have you discovered people in these cultural pockets? We're talking a lot about diplomacy today, but a lot of your members are actually not diplomats or business people at all. They're doing really cool stuff in this cultural connectivity that's there.
Right. I can say that our community is very wide-ranging in the expertise that they have and the areas that they engage with when it comes to Asia. As you said, it's not necessarily just in the public sector. There are those in the private sector. There are those who engage with cultural elements. And I think one thing really is that what gets a lot of people interested in Asia are these cultural elements. And one thing that we recognize that we are doing and will continue to do is kind of ensure that we're engaging those students or young professionals who are interested in those cultural elements, and ensuring that they are aware that their interest and engagement with Asia, there are multiple ways in which you can engage with Asia from a cultural perspective and make a career out of that, but you can also expand beyond the cultural elements and then also further your career that way. So there are multiple elements, and that's one thing that we want to try to do.
And in one plug, we do have an upcoming event on the role of Black America in K-pop, where we really do dive into how has Black America influenced these cultures.
Give us a little preview. What?
No, you have to sign in. You have to tune in.
The preview is I'm moderating.
I don't mean sing right now. I just so there's a real story there you're going to tell about in this event.
Yeah.
So we have a number of younger staff at CSIS who are involved in NABEA. People find it, you find people, but for people watching this and tune in, if they're interested in getting in becoming a member of NABEA or working with NABEA the way we are today with CSIS, what should they do? You have a website?
Yeah, so you can always go to us-nabea.org. That's our website. You can sign up for our listserv if you're an ally and just want to keep track of what NABEA is doing. You can sign up for a listserv. If you want to join the community, there's a sign up for that. We have a whole online platform through Slack where people post articles, discuss policy, post job opportunities, and then we have social media. Usually our tags are US-NABEA, US-NABEA, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram as well.
Yep, and LinkedIn.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say LinkedIn.
Yes, I always forget.
When you guys started this, I'm trying to remember, did you have another national association of some kind in mind? There's Women in National Security, there's Black Professionals in International Affairs, there are other professional and community building groups like this, but did you have any particular model or precedent in mind, or did you create it from whole cloth?
Well, one of the first things we did is we wanted to see if an organization like this existed already. So we were looking, and we're like, because we could just join. That would be a lot easier than making your whole organization. But one thing that we couldn't find any organization out there solely dedicated to linking Black America and Asia to each other. And that's really the niche that we sought to fill. There's other organizations out there that focus on international affairs and Black America, but we really thought that this was a niche that needed to be filled and was waiting for a community to come and fill that and create that space.
What would be great is if some other communities looked at what you're doing and did the same. Because in Asian studies, as you know, Black Americans have been underrepresented. You guys are changing that. Latinx, Hispanic Americans, underrepresented. And so hopefully you're gonna create a bit of a model that others look to. Excellent. Thank you both. You've gone from since I've known you, from 3 to 300. I look forward to doing this in a year or two when you have 3,000 and then 30,000. So we're going to bring up a panel of your members and talk about diplomacy and trade. But Terrell and Chadwick, thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to run the next panel, then I'll turn it over to my colleague Matt Goodman, and I'll invite Ambassador Charles Ray to the stage. Ambassador Ray is here in person, and we have two distinguished diplomats joining us virtually we're in the age of hybrid, so for our hybrid event. Ambassador Ray served as ambassador to Cambodia and to Zimbabwe, two extremely sensitive and difficult diplomatic postings. He was the first U.S. Consul General to Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for POW Missing Personnel Affairs, another incredibly difficult diplomatic assignment, complicated politically and diplomatically. He served in the U.S. Army for 20 years before joining the Foreign Service with 2 tours in Vietnam. We're also joined virtually, I believe, by Ambassador Aurelia Brazeal, who served as the U.S. Ambassador to Ethiopia, to Kenya, and the Federated States of Micronesia, which is a post that's in the news very much these days as we're renegotiating the compacts of free associations. She served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific. When Matt Goodman and I were in grad school, Ambassador Brazeal was one of the omono, the big names in U.S.-Japan relations who we tracked and followed at a time of friction in U.S.-Japan economic relations in particular. Delighted you could join us, Ambassador, virtually. And my friend Harry Thomas, Ambassador is joining us virtually. He served as ambassador to Zimbabwe, also to the Philippines, and to Bangladesh, spent 3 decades in the Foreign Service. He's now at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, but most important, we worked together on the NSC staff in the Bush administration, and Harry taught me and my colleagues how to be good at your job and not take yourself too seriously, which I realize if you're going to survive in the NSC is really critical, important. Nobody thinks of. A real joy to work with and learn from Harry for me in those days. So we'll talk a little bit about diplomacy, come back to some of the themes Ambassador Sinodinos from Australia introduced. But let me start with Ambassador Ray. As you look at the U.S. approach to the region today, to the Indo-Pacific, what do you see as some of our strengths in our diplomacy? And what are some of the areas where we're just underperforming? The ambassador was diplomatic. So you're a retired diplomat. You don't have to be diplomatic. Where are we doing well? Where are we not doing well?
As Harry can tell you, I wasn't a very diplomatic diplomat. But no, I think one of the places that we're doing well, much better than we did during the time when I served in Asia, is that we are becoming more diverse. We are putting people on the ground in Asian countries who more represent the American or the America that we live in. Just to give you an example, when I was Consul General in Ho Chi Minh City, in Vietnam, we had the Consulate General in Ho Chi Minh City and the embassy in Hanoi, and I think the total number of African Americans assigned to those 2 posts was 3, and the other 2 were in Hanoi. So Ho Chi Minh City, I represented African Americans and one of the things that I tried to push was to get more people, more young FSOs to try to get jobs not just in Vietnam but also in other parts of Southeast Asia. Just recently, I was contacted by the public diplomacy officer at Ho Chi Minh City. That office has 2 African Americans who are FSOs who are assigned to it, which is pretty much of a tectonic change in the makeup of the mission there. So I think we're doing well there. I think where we're not doing as well as we should, and this is just my personal opinion as a student of history, is we're not paying, I think, enough attention to the nuances. As the Australian ambassador said, one of the things that the people in the region want from the U.S. is they want for us to be there and to be involved with them as opposed to be there and they're pawns in a game that we're playing with someone else. You know, this whole U.S.-China competition, for example, I think if we were more attuned to history, we wouldn't have been surprised that the 2 of us are major competitors right now. I mean, if you look at the history of East Asia, look at Japan, look at Korea, they went from, in the case of Japan, a country devastated by war and the first victim of an atomic strike, to become a global economy. Korea, I was in Korea my first time in Korea was in 1973 after my last tour in Vietnam. It was a poor country. It was a country that was being run by a military dictatorship, and it is now, I think, the 15th or 13th largest economy in the world. And while it is its application of democracy is sometimes a little odd from an American perspective, compared to what it was in the 60s and 70s, it is a functioning democratic state. And you've mentioned K-pop and Korean soap operas. I mean, culturally, it's on a path to dominate the world culturally. Probably the only thing that we will be left with after the Koreans take over is Coca-Cola will still be a popular brand throughout the world. And so we didn't seem to pay attention to that history, and then we opened trade with China. We worked to get China into the WTO, and if you consider what East Asians have demonstrated themselves historically to be capable of, and you take a behemoth like China with its population, with its history of being sort of the weak cousin for the rest of the world, why should we be surprised when their economy starts to boom and they start to look at other areas where they could be dominant? So, I mean, there's that. There's also, and this, you used the term during the Obama administration, the pivot to Asia. I was serving in Zimbabwe during that administration, and one of the things that always bothered me a bit about it is we don't pay attention to the nuance and to the way people might interpret what we say. To a lot of foreigners who were not in Asia, the term pivot to Asia implies turning away from others. And I don't think we meant that, but we have to be aware that what we mean is secondary to what people think we mean or what people interpret it as. And so you had that potential miscommunication that I don't think we ever effectively addressed. And then you have the issue of pivoting to which Asia.
Right.
I mean, you have East Asia and you have China, and I actually delinked the two because to me East Asia is Korea and Japan, and China is sort of this presence that actually spans quite a few time zones. You have Southeast Asia, you have the, and then Southeast Asia, you have mainland Southeast Asia and insular Southeast Asia. You have the Indo-Pacific, you have India, which is finally, I think, beginning to consider itself as part of that region. And then the Pacific Islands, you have Australia and New Zealand. When you say pivot to Asia, you really have to be more specific.
Yeah.
Who are we pivoting to, and how is that pivot operationalized? And I think if I were to say there's a weakness in our dealing with Asia is that we aren't careful when we say things to make sure that the understanding of what we're saying is clear and all parties understand what we really mean and not just, we're not assuming we said it, we know what we mean, that's it.
Probably because we're talking to ourselves. I mean, the pivot was an article in Foreign Policy designed to change the bureaucratic debate in Washington. That was the audience.
Which is another issue we need to be aware of.
And lo and behold, it turns out the whole world's listening.
Yes.
So, yeah. Ambassador Brazeal, you, looking back and where your career took you and where we are today, you got to be pleased with the U.S.-Japan alliance. It's pretty strong compared to the many difficulties you had to manage in your time as DAS. But what do you think are our strengths and weaknesses today in the region, in diplomacy and in engagement?
Well, I think that first I'll mention in terms of minorities, my experience in Japan is that there was a great curiosity about what being African American, but that in Japan as well as other parts of Asia, the stereotyping that comes out of the United States about African Americans is simply accepted as fact, and so people need to be corrected in terms of their impressions. So I enjoy my time very much in Japan. I think that in terms of our weakness is that we are undervaluing perhaps the region's own capabilities to act in their self-interest. And we're sort of out of date running on that post-World War II image of the United States being strong and many of the countries in the Indo-Asian region as being sort of weaker because of World War II. And I think, in a sense, I'll turn what I just said around as a strength, is that I hope and I see that we seem to have the ability to adjust to new realities in terms of our policies. So I think that the undervaluing is a weakness, but I think the ability to adjust to a new reality is going to be a strength as we look at the Indo-Pacific countries' capabilities and how we can help and what our role should be.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. We sometimes in policy making and policy debates in the U.S. Don't appreciate the agency and the capacity and, the throw weight of countries like Japan and Korea and Australia, but also Indonesia. The Democracy Summit that President Biden held, I thought was a great idea, because we are seeing backsliding in democracy. It does matter to us strategically. But for my part, I thought the administration didn't do enough to consider how perhaps a country like Indonesia could lead, and not just sort of take our script, but show agency and leadership in the region. But as you point out, Ambassador, the famous Winston Churchill line, you can count on the Americans to do all the wrong things before they eventually do the right things. We do have some, we do have some capacity to learn. Harry, Ambassador Thomas, what you've done Bangladesh, the Philippines, you've had some interesting diplomatic assignments, ran the Foreign Service. What do you think we're getting right and wrong in the region?
Well, first, Mike, congratulations on your upcoming assignment. They couldn't have made a better choice, and thank you for your support for these young people. They've greatly benefited from your kind wisdom and guidance. I agree with my fellow ambassadors. The United States is getting things right. We're learning. The challenge is how, and I think I would ask this if I were in an Asian country, are our policies sustainable? Not just because of the current focus on Ukraine, but because when we have a president like our previous president, that can change overnight, where things are not sustainable, especially outside of the military range. So I would hope that we view it as, take the old saw, whole of government and as well as whole of organization approach because of these things, and have not only the State Department and DOD and Commerce and Treasury and the other agencies involved, but also the think tanks and academia, and most importantly, American businesses, continually involved in the organizations, and continue to explain the importance of ASEAN, the challenges we face in India and Pakistan, which are now part of at least Asia for our policy. And I think Ambassador Ray was most correct in nuance. Always learn it's not always about us. Don't make it always about us. Listen to our allies and partners. And I think the Australian ambassador nailed everything on the head in his his opening candid remarks. Thank you.
So the basics of diplomacy, as Ambassador Ray said, are the same that they've always been. You got to know your country, you got to know the history, you need to represent your interests. But over the course of your careers, I'm sure the nature of diplomacy also changed in some important ways with technology. Harry talked about all of society. There are a lot more actors in foreign policy today than when you probably joined the Foreign Service. For people coming into the not just the State Department, but the role of engaging with Asia, because it is all of society. It's think tanks, it's universities. What do you think are the big changes that are afoot that people should be thinking about to have an impact going forward, working with the region? Well,
I mean, you hit on one of the, I think, most significant changes when you said technology. I remember, I mean, my first introduction to Asia was actually in the 1960s. I went to Vietnam in 1968, and you have to, I mean, this was before fax machines were proliferated all over the place, and if you didn't, we didn't have mobile phones. You used walkie-talkies or you used landlines if you were in a place where there were phone wires strung up. My diplomatic career started in 1982, and I remember I'd come out of the Army where we were using, there's probably no more than 3 people or 4 people listening to us who know what a thermofax is, but the military used thermofax to send documents, and I remember I served in Chiang Mai, Thailand in 1981, and it was a major kerfluffle in the State Department when I wanted to install a fax machine in the consulate to be able to fax visa documents back and forth for name clearances, and the lawyers got involved. And so just the technology at the level of things that have to be mastered to get your job done, that's the first thing I think people coming in now have to be aware of. I worked for an ambassador in West Africa in the 90s who didn't know how to turn his computer on, literally. I mean, he did not know how to turn it on or off. He ruined 2 computers before I finally made a deal for him not to touch his computer until I turned it on, and when he was finished, to leave it alone, I would turn it off. Those days are gone. I mean, now, if you're not technologically competent or literate, you find it difficult to work. But there's also the impact that technology has on interactions between states and among people within states that has to be taken into account when you're dealing with them. When I was ambassador to Zimbabwe, a country that was coming out of massive hyperinflation, at one point, stores had nothing on the shelves. The currency had devalued to the point where when you went to a bank and made a withdrawal, you had to take a wheelbarrow to take your proceeds home. There were kids there who had never seen an analog telephone who were routinely using smartphones to go onto the internet and do internet banking. This changes the way you deal with populations and with governments. So whether you're going as a diplomat or whether you're going into a country as a business person or as a researcher, you have to be aware of how technology has affected the evolution of that country and how people communicate. I'm married to a Korean. We met in the 1970s, and the Korea that my wife came from after I married her in the 1970s no longer exists. And if you're dealing with that country, you have to be aware of where they came from, because where they are now is still shaped by where they came from and the culture that they came out of. And these are things that you have to understand, whether you're going there as a diplomat in the embassy or going there to work in the overseas office of a multinational bank. You have to understand the history, because it's often said that we Americans are ignorant of history. I disagree with that. I think the problem is that we tend to be very selective in what parts of history we remember. But the fact is that most other cultures, their actions, their day-to-day actions are informed by their history. Yep. And if you don't realize that when you're dealing with them, you're going to make missteps that will complicate getting your job done.
You know, Harry, you were ambassador in the Philippines your last overseas post, right? And the election right now in the Philippines is really fascinating and gets to Ambassador Ray's point. Mr. Marcos is using social media, some people say misinformation and disinformation, to really shape narratives, to change how the people in the Philippines understand their history, to try to shape the election. That's got to be a really important front for any diplomat serving in Manila right now, to understand how technology and social media is creating different interpretations of history, polarizing politics and stuff. And yet at the same time, I on a sort of personal, anecdotal level, when I travel in East Asia, when I meet with political figures in Japan or Korea or Taiwan or Thailand, I kind of ask, like, who do you talk to at the U.S. Embassy? And this is just anecdotal, but I'm sorry to report the number of American diplomats that these politicians personally know seems to go down every year. It seems like more and more diplomats are doing things with technology and not getting out and actually networking and meeting people. So what did you find when you were in Manila? How did you get your team to get the right balance between the technology and the good old-fashioned gumshoe, getting out there and often drinking with important political figures and diplomats?
Well, Mike, I think it always comes back to leadership. And it's up to the ambassador as a chief of mission to make sure his or her people are out and not behind their desks. I always took junior officers with me to social events. and they had to volunteer to go. You couldn't volunteer them in the new Foreign Service, but most wanted to go, and it gave them a chance. It took junior officers to meet with the foreign minister, meet with the president. I think in any organization, if you have a conference, you need to have the junior people not only to listen, but to learn. But we also did something called America Week, which we took America on the road, a road show in various parts of the Philippines to show not just what the U.S. government was doing, but what U.S. business was doing and U.S. academia. And we partnered with them to show this. And you get people out. I was insistent, and I changed staff aides every 6 months to give them exposure. And I'm not the first Foreign Service officer, the first ambassador to do this. Many of us have done that. But key is not just the Foreign Service officer, it's the military. It is particularly USAID. They just can't be contracting officers. We must use the wonderful technology, but there's no mistaking, no replacement for human interaction, learning the language, learning the culture, understanding who you're dealing with. And I would be a pain. I hated to see at cocktails officers just in groups speaking to themselves or people who they felt comfortable with. That's not their job. So it's really up to the chief of mission and his or her deputy and section heads to make sure this happens. Obviously, the Philippines was a much easier place to do that, as was Bangladesh, than what Charlie and I experienced in Zimbabwe, where nobody wanted to meet with us no matter what we wanted to do. So environments can be difficult. But I think leadership is key.
You, I got to ask, you served in Zimbabwe how many years after Ambassador Ray?
Well, I served there before him as a junior officer under Gib Lamper, 89 to 92. And then I came in 2018, Ambassador Bruce Wharton, outstanding Foreign Service officer, was behind Ambassador Ray.
So I'm guessing that they were still talking about Ambassador Ray when you got there.
They were still talking about his golf game.
Ambassador Brazeal, you were, if I remember correctly, you were economic minister in Tokyo.
Yes.
Yeah, and that was sort of at the height of U.S.-Japan trade fiction. Matt Goodman and I were interning in USTR trying to cause trouble for you at the time. You know, the nature of business diplomacy and economic diplomacy is also, it has to be very different now. And when we look at issues like technology decoupling with China, you know, as Ambassador Sinodinos said, the American retreat from TPP and trade agreements at a time when American business wants to do more in Asia. How do you recommend people think about the business of business diplomacy? And can we create a kind of economic statecraft going forward? Matt will talk about this in a minute with his panel, but are we capable of economic statecraft when the business community, the Congress, you know, the administration's often going in so many different directions? When you were in Tokyo, you had to knit that together. Is that possible again?
I'm not sure it's exactly possible right through here. I was going to say one of the changes I found in diplomacy is that our U.S. disagreements no longer stop at the water's edge. When I first started in diplomacy, that was sort of the tradition that we didn't project our domestic disagreements overseas. And that's no longer possible, especially with technology, but also the disagreements we have engage general publics in other countries as well as our own general public. So I'm not sure we could approach policy the same way we did when I was in Japan. You know, many of the problems I think the U.S. is projecting overseas from our domestic circumstance undercuts the kind of confidence that we want other countries to have in our re-engagement with the world, or our ability to to pursue our own interests, understanding other countries' interests. And by that I mean the racism that we have, the gun violence that we have, the xenophobia, the incompetence in many areas, and the ignorance that we have in some members of our own Congress and high levels in our system. All of this gets reflected and affects how the U.S. is going to be perceived going forward. And I'm just simply not sure how we're going to be able to knit together the kinds of cooperation that we need domestically in order to project our interests overseas, including in Asia.
I'd just like to add one thing. I totally agree with what Ambassador Thomas said about the chief of mission, the ambassador, being sort of the important factor in how we do our diplomacy overseas. And while I talked about, technology and its importance, I hope I didn't create the impression that technology replaces traditional diplomacy. Right. It becomes a tool used to expand it. One of the things I always stressed with people whenever I was in charge of an organization, or when I was consul general in Ho Chi Minh City or Cambodia or Zimbabwe, is that diplomacy is a contact sport. You have to get out on the field, and the technology simply makes it easier for you to do certain things, but nothing takes the place of actually putting boots on the ground, of looking someone in the eye when you deal with them. Just as an example, and some people, including some on my staff, thought it was a bit of an affectation, but when I was in Cambodia, I visited every province, to include some that are almost unreachable during the rainy season. In Zimbabwe, I went to every province. And I visited every major and minor ethnic group in the country, to include some that most people have never heard of. Same thing in Vietnam. As Consul General, I was responsible. My consular district was from the city of Hue south to Phu Quoc Island. I put my feet on the ground in each province in my consular district at least once, in some cases multiple times. I also insisted that my staff get out and do the same, not just taking them with me, but insisted that they get out and see things on the ground for themselves before they start making analysis or reporting on them. Just as an example, I had my political counselor in Zimbabwe actually participate in a spirit seance in a village.
Did you clear that with Washington first?
No.
I don't know which part of the State Department you'd send that to.
Well, we actually did we did a general analysis report because, and the reason was this: we had heard that Mugabe was, a lot of his decisions were shaped by his consulting with shamans. And so in order to be able to address that and the possibility, we had to have a better understanding of how this whole thing worked. My political counselor and I sat down, and we thought a good way to do it was have someone from this embassy actually experience one. He was a changed person when he came back from that trip, but we did a report that I think helped the State Department and maybe even others in the decision-making apparatus better understand the factors motivating the people we were having to deal with.
Yeah. Ambassador Brazeal, your last point about the impact of American racism on our diplomatic engagement is really important. If you think about, for example, U.S.-Japan relations, Woodrow Wilson's rejection of the anti-racism clause in the League of Nations, the Alien Exclusion Acts, I mean, all of these had profound effect, as you know, on Japan's view of the United States, on Japan's view of democracy, on Japan's view of American leadership, and fueled a Japanese foreign policy in the 30s that was absolutely inimical to our interests, right? It goes without saying.
Yes.
It has a huge impact. But more recently, when the previous administration was floating the idea of banning students from China in American universities, the harshest reaction against it was in places like Tokyo and Seoul, American allies, who saw this what they perceived as a racial approach to a problem that that affected them. But I also think we recover pretty well. So, for example, with the Black Lives Movement, we have a colleague at Georgetown from Indonesia who's writing on this, but the Black Lives Movement in the US spawned a Papua Lives Movement, Matters in West Papua. So the ability to sort of change norms and affect society and mobilize also can, sort of the other side of the coin, can inspire people. And we in our diplomacy probably need to think harder about how we take all that into account. So I'm glad you raised it. So we're gonna turn next to the panel on trade and economics. Ambassador Sinodinos, we asked to talk about, can America lead in Asia, and he talked about American leadership. And I think what you heard from this very distinguished panel is what leadership means on the ground. And what's terrific about NABEA is you're creating waves of new leaders who can do this. So I want to thank Ambassador Ray, Ambassador Brazeal, Ambassador Thomas. It was a great discussion. Thank you very much, Harry. Great to see you all. And over to Matt Goodman. Thank you.
Okay. All right, we'll just wait for our other panelists, I hope, to appear. Terry Batch should be joining us online. But maybe I can do my juggling act and stall while we're getting that online. So I'm Matt Goodman, as Mike said. I'm Senior Vice President here for Economics at CSIS, and delighted to be joining this conference and to follow such a distinguished group of diplomats who are real legends in my own career, and just honored and appreciate your service as well. Thank you for that. But we saved, as always, the best for last, the economics and business conversation, which everybody loves. As I joke, they do life and liberty, and we do the pursuit of happiness up here. So it's going to be a lot of fun, and we're really fortunate here to be joined by two just terrific panelists, one of whom I've known for a long time, Marc Mealey, who is Senior Vice President for Policy at the US-ASEAN Business Council. He manages, actually seems to do just about everything there. He manages the production of the Council's information products, coordinates advocacy efforts across the country, and industry committees, and he serves, and this is the role I know him in, as the in-house lead on international trade policy, in Southeast Asia. So he has 20 years of experience in trade and economics. He's worked just about in every branch of Washington life, at USDA, at an NGO, as a consultant, and in Congress. He has a BA in economics and third world studies from Oberlin College and an MS in economics from the University of Florida. So delighted to have Marc with us here in person. And then she is now on screen, Ms. Terry Batch, who is Senior International Trade Specialist with the U.S. Department of Commerce, and she's actually in West Los Angeles, California. At least she's posted to West Los Angeles, California. I assume you're somewhere near there now, Terry, and we're delighted to have you with us. She is currently Director of the Global Diversity Export Initiative, which she's going to tell us a little bit about. That's a new role, but she also founded the China Initiative there in the FCS office there in LA, and she's also going to tell us about that. Terry received her BS in Computer Science from Spelman College and a Master's of Public Administration from the University of Southern California. She spent 2 years doing language training in Beijing and in Taipei, and speaks Mandarin Chinese. She is not a member of NABEA, I believe, but that may change after this event. So, but delighted to have, Marc is a member, by the way, but we're delighted to have both of you with us. And with no further ado, let me start with you, Marc. Just tell us a little bit about what you're doing at the US-ASEAN Business Council. You're working, I know, on SME issues, working on the recovery of the travel and tourism sector. I know we've done a little bit of work on the financial integration story in Southeast Asia. Tell us a little bit about what you do, because I'm not sure everybody knows about the US-ASEAN Business Council.
First of all, one, it's really a great honor and pleasure to be here. I want to thank CSIS and NABEA for hosting this event. Kind of wish, I'm now 30 plus years into my career, Wish there was an organization like NABEA back then, but it's great to contribute to its continued growth and development now. Also really want to acknowledge, CSIS, you've been a really good partner with the Council. Not only did we recently host a very, again, great conference on the Indo-Pacific region just last week, but just yesterday, CSIS published, I think, one of the best documents I've read around the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, really pulling together perspectives from our friends and allies and trade partners in Asia on how they are perceiving the soon-to-be-launched IPEF. I think the real significance of that document is that by understanding some of those points of view, it does begin to, I think, offer some perspective on the fundamental question of this gathering. Can America lead in Asia? I've got my own, personal points of view on that question, which hopefully we can get back to, but I think it dovetails quite nicely to the work at the US-ASEAN Business Council, which is a trade association of U.S. companies that operate in one or more of the 10 countries in Southeast Asia. Obviously, our focus in 2022 really has zeroed in on, I would say, 4 kind of strategic areas. Number one, obviously supporting economic recovery, again, from COVID, because as we all know, all societies around the world were negatively impacted by that challenge. In some countries, COVID is still a challenge because we all know there have been issues around, how shall we say, the unequal distribution of vaccines for populations. So there are countries in Southeast Asia that still today really have not been able to sort of reach significant levels of vaccination status. Second important area of the Council's efforts focus on SME development in Southeast Asia. In fact, we've been very fortunate to have a number of American multinational companies that feel, both for their own commercial interests, but also as part of their good CSR work, to really invest in supporting the ecosystems that they rely upon in doing business in those countries. And so we actually recently relaunched and elevated our SME Online Academy, which basically is an online platform that provides a whole host of resources in now multiple languages for small businesses throughout the Southeast Asia region. And we're very excited about the opportunities we can push there. Thirdly, as many of you know, many of the countries in Southeast Asia, their GDPs are diverse, exports, manufacturing, but a number of countries are very heavily focused on the travel and tourism industries. We all know, going to Thailand, Phuket, Indonesia, Bali, they provide a major source of livelihoods for many people, many of the citizens of those countries. This year, actually beginning late last year, we began to launch a series of on-the-ground travel and tourism roadshows that really brought together elements of the travel industry, the tourism industry, airline industry, and really engaging with governments in the region on how they could approach, and again, every country is going to do their own thing based upon their own realities, but how they could really approach enabling people once again to travel across borders again, but do it obviously as safe as possible. And one of the things that we've been trying to encourage, where you can do this with ASEAN, since either are 10 countries, different levels of development, but there is a strong sense of regional cooperation amongst the 10 countries. And so one of the real takeaways that we're focused on in that initiative is to really see if the 10 countries can agree, let's say, on some similar standards and principles around this is what you must do to be able to travel in the country. So there could be sort of a homogeneous environment for travel, again, in all 10 countries. And then last but not least, we all live in a more digital world, and so digital economic development remains, again, a fundamental focus of the organization. Obviously, in Southeast Asia, there are a number of countries that are very much at the, I would say, are becoming real leaders in digital technology, particularly in terms of digital trade, something we'll turn back to in a second. But there's also issues around closing digital gaps and unequal access to technologies. And so I think that also remains a very important public policy area that we've been able to help support the efforts of a number of governments in the region to address some of those issues.
Okay, that's great. And you've touched on a lot of things that I think get to the issue of U.S. leadership beyond just providing, military and diplomatic support, but we're doing, and not even just providing products and services, but a lot of the things you talked about kind of are the best of what America has to offer. So I want to come back back to some of that. But let me bring Terry into the conversation first. First of all, Terry, to be honest, I've worked in Washington for 35 years, and I've known a lot of people in the Foreign Commercial Service, and I've worked with them here in Washington. I've worked with them in embassies overseas, but I was not aware of how much of a presence the Foreign Commercial Service has across the United States. So if you could just tell us a little bit about that presence, especially as you've seen it there in LA, and then tell us about your current role in this, the Global Diversity Export Initiative, and then I will later come back to your China and Asia stuff. But please introduce us a little bit to what you do out there, and you know, for the general audience here who I don't think know about this.
Sure. First of all, I just want to say thank you for having me on this session and with such distinguished panelists. I feel really honored to be here and to be representing my organization, and especially amongst the ambassadors that are here. And I have to give a special shout out to Ambassador Brazeal, who is my Spelman sister. And I believe she received an honorary degree when I was there, because I do remember Spelman honoring her when I was a student, and I'm class of 99, so I think it was around 99, or it might have been 2000. So, but anyway, I just wanted to just give a brief overview of who we are, because I think the U.S. field that's a part of the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service might get lost in this conversation when we're talking about our relationship and America's leadership in Asia. But the work that I do and the role that I have, we play a very important role, because we actually touch the American businesses. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I have been based here for going on almost 20 years in our Export Assistance Center. And just to give you an idea of our organization, so many of you might know us from the U.S. embassies and consulates around the world, and that's only half of our organization. The other half is the U.S. field that is made up of about 100 offices across the U.S., and we're pretty much in every major city. In the state of California, we have 13 offices. In Los Angeles, we have 2 offices. We have a downtown Los Angeles and a West LA office. I sit in the West LA office. And our job really is to work hand in hand with businesses and help them to access our services in our embassies and consulates around the world. We also support U.S. companies that are going to trade shows, both domestically and internationally. We organize trade missions. We do a number of different services to actually the hands-on work that needs to be done to help U.S. companies get across the, overcome whatever challenges or barriers, or help them to do business easier overseas. And our sweet spot is working with small and medium-sized businesses. As you can imagine, the larger companies, they need the U.S. government, but they need it in a different way. So when we're working with small and medium-sized businesses, we're actually supplementing them and being the international arm of their business that they might not have in-house. So as a trade specialist, we do that in a number of different ways. We focus by region of the world, so specifically on a country. So a lot of my work has been focused on China, but then we also focus by industry sector. In a place like Los Angeles, we have pretty much every industry sector that makes up the U.S. economy. So myself and my colleagues, what we do is we focus on an industry, and we help companies in those industries, and it could be anywhere around the world where they're trying to do business. And the goal of our organization is to increase U.S. exports. So we don't work anything on the import side of the house, but only on helping companies to grow their business, to find new partners, to understand the laws, the regulations, and overcome any barriers that they might encounter as they're looking to expand. And I think you asked me about the Global Diversity Export Initiative, and I will just put a brief plug in for that. And basically what that is this is our attempt to do a better job of reaching out to underserved and underrepresented communities in international trade. So I head up this initiative, and we're focusing on outreaching to minority-owned businesses. So whether it's Black-owned, Latinx, Asian, Native American, communities that we have typically not done the work that we should be doing to make sure they have the message of exporting and how they can diversify their business by looking at overseas markets. It also focuses on women-owned companies, veteran-owned, and also LGBTQ+. And that is a response to, there's an executive order 13985, you're probably all familiar with it, in terms of looking at federal resources and how we are deploying our resources and how are we working with underserved and underrepresented communities. So with that, I'll leave that there, but there's a lot more that could be said about it, but it really is the start of us looking at how can we get the message of opportunities, global opportunities for U.S. companies around the world.
Okay, that's really helpful overview and makes clear how important what you're doing is. And I think you want to put in a pitch because you're looking for talent, right? So you've already made the pitch, but you want to add anything to the pitch?
Yes, I will. Just real quick. So currently, and it just opened yesterday, so the timing of this panel is really great, and I'm so glad that you're working with NABEA, which I wish NABEA existed when I was a student. I would have definitely been a member. I think the work that Chadwick and Terrell are doing is just phenomenal. I was a student who studied abroad in China, studied abroad in Taiwan, and I was the only one that looked like me. So it would have been nice to be plugged into a community. And even throughout my career, I've been not the only one, but one of few. So one of the things that we're trying to do within our organization is really increase our diversity amongst our foreign service officers. And so we just opened the application period, which will be open for the next 2.5 weeks. And anyone that's interested in applying to be a foreign service officer can apply. And we are not just opening it up and saying apply, because I've done this before where I've encouraged people to apply and then they don't even get past the written assessment, better long to go on to the oral part of the assessment. So we're really making an effort to educate and coach people along the process of what it takes to become a foreign service officer. So we have several information sessions that are coming up this week and next week. And I can send that information. I think I might have sent it to you already, Matt. But we would just encourage folks that if they want to have a career in promoting U.S. companies and being a commercial diplomat, and on the business side, we only do the business side. State Department does all of the diplomatic relationship building between our country and others. But to support U.S. businesses, then now is a perfect time to apply. It's a perfect time to get into our system, and we want to increase the diversity. I mean, that's a major thing that the employees, myself and others have advocated for in our organization is we need to have more diversity and to better represent what the general U.S. public looks like when we're going out and we're working and trying to promote U.S. businesses. So thank you for letting me give that plug, and I'm happy to provide more information about it. Folks can connect with me on LinkedIn. I could help coach through the process and also connect folks to our people that can tell them about this career and what all it entails and how to not only get your foot in the door, but also be successful once you do get your foot in the door.
Great, and presumably at the Commerce website, trade.gov, is that right? There'll be more information about these opportunities and ability to apply, right?
Yes, there is. The job posting is on usajobs.gov already.
Okay.
And then also on trade.gov, there is information about the assessment and the listening sessions or the training sessions that are coming up as well.
Great, super. Okay, well this is great, and there's also a great YouTube video that she did as well. If you Google Terry Batch and YouTube, you'll find it, I think. So let me come back to you, Marc, and ask you kindly plugged our paper on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but you don't have to do that anymore. I just want to know what you're hearing from the countries in the region, from Southeast Asia about this initiative. What you're hearing from American business, for that matter, about this initiative. I mean, it isn't the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's something different from that. It's big and a little complex. Are you hearing kind of similar things to what was in our paper? again, not to endorse our paper, I'm just saying I'm genuinely interested in what you're hearing about this.
Just to pick up on Terry's point, you know, the work that her organization to really try to support the ability of U.S.-based businesses to be able to export to the rest of the world, that work is becoming more challenging because things in the global economy and in terms of our ability to engage in terms of trade policy, particularly in Asia, we should be very frank, we're not keeping up. And in a sense, because the U.S. government per se, not talking about multinational companies and other aspects of our society, but because our government has not really been able to engage in trade policy with Asia, other countries around the world have, which is the first piece. So if you're a Canadian company, you now have duty-free access to export your good in Vietnam. If you're in California, you may have to pay a duty of 10 to 15%. What that cost would be in the shelf.
That's the price of pulling out of TPP.
Correct.
Because Canada's getting that through TPP.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
And in addition, Asian countries within the Asia-Pacific region are also moving forward and doing their own new regional trade liberalization agreements. So we all know, for example, the RCEP agreement, which includes 15 Asian countries, is now the largest free trade area in the world. It does not include the United States. Again, for US-based businesses, that's a disadvantage. For a global company, you figure out how to navigate that space. But the reality is, we should probably expect to see trade within the Asia-Pacific region relative to trade outside of the region to become a bit more efficient, a bit more, how should we say, effective, and a bit more predictable. Because now these 15 countries have a new common set of rules of origin. They have lower tariffs amongst themselves. And so if you're a business person, you might find, yeah, it's easier for me, relatively speaking, to trade with Thailand if I'm in China, or Malaysia to Korea relative to Malaysia and the United States relative to Thailand. So these are the kinds of ways that the world has changed, and we have not really kept up. So with regard to IPEF, and again, your paper, I think, did a great job of capturing some perspectives.
Okay.
Let me share with you in terms of what the U.S. business community is thinking about IPEF. Number one, it is very important because we've been absent at that national level for many, many years now. This is an opportunity to, again, kind of a first step, which needs to be a first step of many, to really kind of rebuild some confidence in the United States by major trading partners in the Asia-Pacific region. It can't be a one-off thing. That's the first challenge. Secondly, the U.S. industry wants the approach to include higher standards, disciplines, and commitments relative to many other agreements that are out there. And that's understandable because if you're a business person, you want rules that you think can really help you expand your business. And that's what your focus is. The trade-off, of course, with that is, in order to get other countries maybe to agree to higher standards, higher commitments and disciplines on like labor or the environment, you generally have to offer something in return. And historically, it's been market access, an opportunity for their business people to maybe do more business with us. Unfortunately, right now, IPEF doesn't include that. So our business company has said, we are urging the administration maybe to rethink that initial position, that it should look to try to include market access provisions as part of the process. Third, there's been a lot of discussion around, can IPEF be a way that invites any interested country in Asia to join it? Because one thing we should keep in mind, in Asia, there's already a whole host of agreements, frameworks, and initiatives that are already in place. And in fact, the Canadians are even negotiating their own FTA with countries in Southeast Asia as we speak. One key principle in all of these, I think, agreements and approaches that we see in Asia is this value of inclusiveness. In other words, if you want Asian leaders in trade to value the American regional idea, they're telling us, for us to really see it as regional, it needs to be inclusive. It needs to offer pathways for interested countries that maybe aren't quite ready now to join, but maybe see a pathway to joining. Because if it's not really perceived as having that principle of inclusiveness, some countries have told us we kind of find it hard to be a regional framework. It could be a framework amongst like-minded countries. It could be a framework with just America's special friends. And if that's what it is, that's what it is. But that's not regional. That's what it is. So that's another point we've said, again, this value of how can we make IPEF, if it's going to have high standards, also be a way it offers, maybe through cooperation, maybe through capacity building, maybe through some training, that pathway. I give you, the ambassador from Australia noted very early, Australia has been very, very aggressive in pursuing preferential free trade agreements for its companies. I just found out today in talking with a colleague based in Singapore that the government of Australia is spending between 150 and 200 million US dollars over the next 4 years in building the capacity of governments in the region to fully implement RCEP in order for Australian exporters to get all the benefits they think they can get out of that agreement. I totally get why the Australian government would do, because what's the use of negotiating that liberalization effort with countries that maybe can't fully implement it? So you say, you know what, we'll actually help you implement those commitments because we know it'll actually support our bottom line as well. So I think, again, that's the kind of thing I think our industry members saying we should be thinking creative like that also as we want to make IPEF to have as big as impact that we'd like.
Okay, terrific. Well, there's a lot to follow up on there. We don't have a huge amount of time, and I want to get back to Terry on another question, which is you're doing a global role now, but you had a role in setting up your China operation there, right? Could you tell us a bit about that? And then going forward, I think you've got a bunch of Asia-related initiatives that your colleagues are working on, missions coming up, and just can you describe what those are about and how they help to link it to the bigger theme of this conference, how that helps promote not just U.S. commercial interests, but kind of broader U.S. interests in that region?
Yeah, so just real briefly, previously, so probably about 10 years ago, I set up what's called our Global China team. And one of the ways that we operate within our organization is we do everything by teamwork because we are a network of offices both in the U.S. and with our embassies and consulates around the world. So when we really want to make impact for a particular region or a particular industry sector, we form teams around those sectors. So one of the things that we noticed this was 10 plus years ago, we always have had an Asia Pacific team and where we would promote opportunities for U.S. companies in the region. We had a huge conference that we would have here in Los Angeles. We actually worked with the US-ASEAN Business Council back then. Mark, since you've been around so long, you probably are familiar. It was a conference that we did at USC every year where we would bring all of our officers to the U.S. and they would meet one-on-one with our U.S. businesses. So one of the things that we noticed during that time was everybody wanted to talk about China. China had just joined the WTO. There were so many opportunities to do business in China. And so what we needed at the time was to break out China from the rest of the world and really focus our efforts on trying to promote U.S. companies and small and medium-sized companies in China and to help them to navigate doing business there. So I helped to found our Global China team, which worked with our offices, and we have offices, 6 offices, actually 5 now, throughout China, and to connect those offices that are on the ground and have the relationships and know what is happening locally to help small and medium-sized businesses to better understand what's happening in the market, to help to organize a plan, whether it's a trade mission or a trade show or whatever might be on the ground, so that we can hold the hands of these companies as they go there and help them to avoid mistakes that are common mistakes, or help them to navigate the system. And so that's what all of our teams are involved in, whether it's we have a Western Hemisphere team that does the same thing, we have a Europe team, we have a Middle Eastern Africa team. So really the purpose is to help them navigate. And just going back to Marc's comments about, the current kind of state of play with the US and Asia, it is more difficult now because back then when I was a China team leader, it was almost like we had so many trade missions going, and we had so many activities that was hard to keep up with. Now it's a little bit different. You know, the trade relationship, I don't need to tell this audience, has changed dramatically. And that's not to say that things are not still happening. They still happen, but it's very strategic, very focused. I can say even at the height of our trade dispute with China, during the last administration, I led a trade mission that focused on the themed entertainment industry from California to China, which was booming at the time. Obviously, that industry has been hit hard with COVID, but Universal Studios still opened their largest theme park in the world there in right outside of Beijing. So that's all U.S. Intellectual property and a lot of U.S. smaller and medium-sized businesses that fed into that project. And so it's an opportunity for U.S. exports. So, and just going back to what are we doing now, we're still involved in promoting U.S. companies. This administration has a large or a high priority for clean tech. And so a lot of the engagements that we're seeing in the region is around clean tech and supporting U.S. companies that are in the clean tech space. So for instance, in June, we have a trade mission that's going to Southeast Asia that's going to be led by our undersecretary. It's going to Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And that's where, when I talked about our teams, we have an energy team. So the energy team is organizing around that, for that particular sector and leading it to Southeast Asia. Also in June, our global environmental team is also organizing a clean air trade mission that's going to India. Again, high priority for this administration to promote U.S. clean tech globally, and also looking at Asia. There's obviously a lot of opportunity there. And then in addition, later on in the year, we have a trade mission that's going to Indonesia, Singapore, and Japan that's focusing on advanced manufacturing. So there's a number of different activities that's happening, and even though I agree with Marc when he said, you know, the U.S. is we took a step back, especially when we got out of TPP, and the advantages that a U.S. company would have with reduced tariffs and pre-negotiated state of play for a U.S. company, that's kind of lingering out there. But I think the opportunities for U.S. companies still exist, and we're still organizing, we're still pushing this. As the trade policy catches up or the U.S. re-engages, it'll be just that much better for a company. But I think the companies are not waiting. The private sector does. I always tell people the private sector does what the private sector does, and they will find a way to do business. They'll find a way to make money. And so, you know, as the trade policy catches up, we want to still, as the U.S. government, we still want to be engaged. We still want to be relevant to U.S. industry and to U.S. businesses. So that's why we continue to organize these things. We continue to stay involved and to continue to stay a part of the conversation so that we can be supportive and as effective as possible for U.S. companies.
Okay, terrific. And that's a great note that I want to add an accent to in a second. We're just about out of time. I want to ask you each 30 seconds, because I'm always interested in this question. What got you interested in Asia? Terry, I'm going to start with you, and then you, Marc. Why did you originally get interested in Asia or China?
Well, you know, it's really simple. I grew up in Georgia. I'm a Georgia girl. I had a couple of friends that were Chinese when I was growing up. I grew up right outside of Atlanta, and it was curiosity. And when I was at Spelman, they encouraged every Spelman night, if they could, to study abroad. And when the opportunity came up, and I had a professor who helped me to get a scholarship, the Boren Scholarship is what it's called now, and I went to Beijing and studied and loved it. And the rest is history.
Great, excellent, great story. Marc?
Yeah, actually, well, you know, I started out my career 10 years doing mostly work on Africa, Eastern Europe, and Middle East. And being in this town in Washington, you can get put in boxes. And a lot of folks knew me in this town as, oh yeah, Marc Mealey does work on Africa. At that point in my career, I said to myself, I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to be, quote unquote, in that box at that phase of my career. I also began to notice in this town that China was kind of becoming the game, so to speak. So I made a conscious choice 20 years ago to basically say, I'm going to rebrand myself as Marc Mealey, who does work on Southeast Asia. And
Great.
that's the path I've been on.
Excellent. Well, different paths, but they both led you to a really fascinating part of the world. And the point I was going to make, kind of as an editorial comment on top of what you've both touched on, is that, the first panel, to link the two panels, the first panel is about people who are paid professionally to do diplomacy, and it's a contact sport, and it's, as I say, I mean it when I say thank you for your service. My best man was most recently ambassador to Burkina Faso, and, he was in danger as well as, doing really important work, to advance American interests, so I have huge respect for it. But what business people do as well is also a kind of diplomacy that is maybe sometimes underestimated. In this town, I think there's a lot of, sometimes talk about how, trade agreements favor big business or something, and that's somehow what it's all about, is trying to make businesses make more money. And really, I think of it differently, which is that, who else is out in the field along with our diplomats? It's our business people, and they're putting forward, products and services and all the things that go with it, the rule of law and good after service and capacity building and other things that both of you have touched on in some ways. And I think that's what's really important about our business presence in the region. And if we can do that, we don't have to throw trillions of dollars the way China is throwing at belts and roads and things. If we can put forward our best diplomats and our best business principles and approaches and best people, of course, which is what this is all about. So I want to thank both of our terrific panelists, and I hope you'll join me in thanking them as well for their participation. All right. And with that, I think I turn back to Mike to close us out. We'll stay here just while you do that.
No, thanks, Matt.
All right.
Thanks, Mark. That was, and thanks also to Terry. That was a great discussion. I learned a lot. This was really interesting. Our framing question for the conference was, can the U.S. lead in Asia? It was a little provocative. And we heard from Arthur Sinodinos, the Australian ambassador, one of our closest friends in the region. America can lead, and please lead, must lead. We heard from Ambassador Ambassador Brazeal, and Harry Thomas, what leadership looks like on the ground when America leads, and how important it is that when we have leadership on the ground, it looks like America. And we heard just now from Mark and Terry and Matt that we are innovative. I mean, I did not know, I learned a lot. What Terry's doing with the Foreign Commercial Service, reaching out to underrepresented communities and getting them in the export game, getting them out there. And polls show that in particular, younger Americans across all ethnic groups, across gender and geographically, younger Americans are hungry for more engagement, for global engagement in diplomacy. They're much more open to trade, and they think alliances are good, and they want to have allies and partners. So, we're on the right side of history here, but obviously if we're going to lead, we've got to draw on all the talents and all the communities that make up the fabric of the United States, and that's why it's such a pleasure for us, Terrell and Chadwick and Kyle and everyone at NABEA to do this with you. And I hope we do it again. My only request is next time, K-pop, please. Thank you all very much. Yeah.